Now, the world, of course, is watching to see how Syria's political landscape changes after the fall of the Assad regime. The country is now in the hands of an Islamist rebel group known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. It is designated a terrorist group by several Western nations. HTS's sudden rise to power has left governments around the world wondering how to respond. The European Union's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, says the bloc is sending a senior diplomat to Damascus to make contact with the new government. She made that announcement after arriving at a meeting of foreign ministers in Brussels. And she said the diplomat will leave for Damascus today. Let's get more on this with DW Correspondent Rosie Birchard, who is joining us from Brussels. Rosie, tell us more about the EU's first efforts to establish contact with Syria's new government. What more do you know?
Well, look, for more than a week now, the EU's been facing something of a diplomatic dilemma here, because we saw in the early hours after the news was announced, we saw the European Union and its leaders welcoming the fall of Assad, the end of dictatorship. But of course, the big question mark for their diplomacy is really around what comes next. And that's because, as you noted, HTS, under the EU's current rules, is considered terrorist. As a terrorist organisation, that means that any of its assets within the EU are frozen and that there's a prohibition on any EU actors from providing any funds to HTS. And I can tell you that just a week ago, I asked the EU and the EU's foreign policy spokesperson in a press conference whether they would be looking into having talks or establishing ties with HTS. And at that moment, the answer was clear. It was an absolute no. Well, hasn't everything in these events in Syria been just a lesson in how much difference a few days can make in history? And a few days can make a big difference in EU policy too, because now the bloc's foreign policy chief has announced that a top diplomat will be heading to Damascus to make contact with what she called the new leadership there. The EU is stressing that they're looking at actions and not just listening to words. But the message overall we heard here at these talks in Brussels was that Syria, in the EU's eyes, faces a positive future, but also still a very uncertain one.
And what about the topic of Syrian migrants and asylum seekers in the EU? Can we expect officials to address that?
It's not officially on the agenda, but let me tell you, it's in the background of every single kind of diplomatic discussion here. That's because, of course, second to those countries near Syria, neighbouring it in the region, such as Turkey and Lebanon, the European Union has been a big host of Syrian refugees and asylum seekers. And we know that just a few months ago, when Assad was still in power, there was a push from a handful of EU countries, led by Italy, to consider re-establishing ties with Assad with a view to being able to speed up deportations and turn down asylum-seeking requests. Now, with that kind of context, you can imagine that some of those same countries may now be keen to establish ties with HTS with that same view in mind, trying to speed up deportations. There will be differences of opinions across this European Union on that topic, but we've seen it already coming up in national debates. For example, Austria has already announced it will provide what it calls a bonus to Syrian refugees who voluntarily decide to return. But given that we simply don't know what the conditions will be like for people in Syria in the future, the EU's official line is still that there is no safe conditions in place to facilitate deportations, which means forced returns. But they think that many people will want to return voluntarily. But like so many things in this bloc over the last few years, migration and asylum policy really has been such a toxic and divisive topic. And I think we can expect that to continue with regards to how the EU approaches its ties with HTS and Damascus in future.
Rosie, thank you so much for all of that. That's DW's Rosie Birchard reporting from Brussels.